high-speed videos to provide slow motion. I am using 240 frames per second. I think that is the most realistic slow motion speed. So when you play back at normal speed, my Samsung smartphone plays back at 30 frames per second. When I play back at 30 frames a second, it's clear what really was happening, and I will show you. But the problem I'm always faced with is, why is it cameras don't do slow motion at 240 frames per second? Only smartphones do that. I know of two Sony cameras, the RX 104 and the Sony ZV-1, that only record about 2 to 4 seconds of 240 frames per second. That is useless. You can't record anything. My smartphone, Samsung Galaxy S9 Plus, I can record for 2-3 minutes, 10 minutes without any problem. So what is the problem that they are facing, the camera manufacturers are facing? Let's have a look. Let's analyze it one by one and see where the potential problem is. So the first problem I suspected was the files will be huge when we run at 240 frames per second instead of the normal 30 or 60 frames per second. Let's have a look at the size of the files generated by my Samsung smartphone and check out whether it is really a serious issue or not. This is the first video that I made of water dripping from a tap. When played back at 30 frames per second, it takes 6 minutes 6 seconds to run, and the file size was 398 megabytes. So from there we can see that the MP4 version of this file is generated at about 1.0874 megabytes per second, or 65 megabytes per minute, which is quite a small file. This video is about a pot of oats boiling away, and as it bubbles you can see how it bursts open. The video took, when played back at normal speed 30 frames per second, this video took 9 minutes 41 seconds and was 632 megabytes in size. So you can see that the file size of 632 megabytes is actually generated at, after compression, is actually generated at 1.0877 megabytes per second, or 65 megabytes per minute, which is not much data being produced by a slow motion video of at 240 frames per second. This video is about water dripping into the bowl, and it is done at 240 frames per second, but when slowed down to 30 frames per second, it takes 6 minutes 20 seconds and is 414 megabytes, which means that the compressed image, the MP4 file, is generated at 1.0894 megabytes per second, or 65.37 megabytes per minute, which is not much of a file size when you consider that the video is played back at 30 frames per second. This would mean that for full HD videos, 240 frames per second videos, they would a 64 gigabyte SanDisk SD card will hold about 1000 minutes or 16 hours of video. A 16 gigabyte card would hold about 4 hours of video. For 4K video, the 64 gigabyte card would hold about 4 hours of video, and the 16 gigabyte card would hold about 1 hour of video at 240 frames per second. So from here we can see that the file size generated by 240 frames per second videos are actually not an issue for camera manufacturers. The SD card is actually quite large for the amount of memory required to save 240 frames per second videos. So let's look at the speed of the SD cards. My card is rated at 30 megabytes per second, so it shouldn't be a problem at all for me to record either 4K or full HD at 240 frames per second, because my speed requirement is only 1 megabyte per second. So now the other thing to look at is the time it takes for the camera to focus on a subject, and how fast can it do the calculation. So I tested the speed of focusing. This is a very approximate system because I don't have the proper equipment to do it properly, but I focus from outside the window to the handphone, smartphone, where the clock is running, to see how fast it takes. And it looks like it's about a second for my A5100 camera, which is a pretty old technology. Let's say you want to do a high-speed video at 240 frames per second of a car moving at 40 kilometers an hour, which is 25 miles per hour. It would have moved about 11 meters in 1 second. Or 36 feet. So at 240 frames per second, the camera would be taking a photograph every 4 milliseconds. Just over 4 milliseconds. And that means the car would have moved 4.6 centimeters in that 4 milliseconds. Every 4 milliseconds taking a picture, right? So in that 4 milliseconds, it would have taken, the car would have moved 4.6 centimeters or 1.8 inches, just under 2 inches. So your focusing is not an issue, because the movement is so small at 40 kilometers an hour, 25 miles per hour, right? So if a normal person is walking or moving around, we really don't have to change the focusing, right? Almost negligible amount of change. In a normal family setting, or you're on the beach and you're taking a slow motion picture of your friends, they're not going to move that fast, right? So you really don't need to do some intensive focusing and adjustments. In fact, if you kept the camera lens focusing fixed, as in manual focusing, it won't make a difference. The speed of focusing is not really an issue. What they could do is separate the focusing algorithm, the way it moves, from the picture taking algorithm. The specs shows that Sony cameras can take 20 pictures a second, which means that while it's taking 20 pictures a second, you don't have to focus every 1/20th of a second, right? Even 1/10th of a second is okay, because your subject is not going to move that far. This means that when you are doing high-speed video at 240 frames per second, you can focus every 12 frame. You don't have to focus at every frame. The only camera that I know that can focus at 240 frames per second is the recently launched Sony A1, Sony Alpha 1. That camera can focus at 240 times a second, which is phenomenally fast. But do we really need that kind of speed? Unless you're doing high speed videos of fast moving objects, very fast moving objects, because even at 40 kilometers an hour or 25 miles an hour, if the car is moving away from you or coming towards you, every 4 milliseconds, the movement is just a little bit, right? Should all cameras have 240 frames per second high-speed video capability? Another thing to remember is that under normal conditions, let's say you are in the bright sunlight and you are running your camera aperture setting at f22. When you go to 240 frames per second, the amount of light falling is 1 over 240th of the amount in normal conditions. So your image is very much dimmer. For example, my camera for wide angle it's f22. If it could run 240 frames per second, the amount of light would have been reduced so much that it would have to open the aperture to f3.5, which is about 32 times more light. But my shutter speed has to be fast enough so that I don't lose the clarity of the high-speed video, right? So probably better than 1/60th of a second or 1/80th or 100th or 1/25 of a second. That means if the shutter speed cannot drop to compensate for the loss of light, so the ISO has to go up by a factor of 8 times. That means it has to go, let's say I was running at 100 ISO, it has to go to 200 to 400. That means there's 2 times 2 is 4 times 2 again is 8, which gives me ISO of 800. And that's how I can keep my shutter speed relatively clear and allow for the drop in brightness to compensate for the drop in brightness when running at 240 frames per second. So far, it's the smartphones that are able to run high-speed videos so you can get slow motion at 240 frames per second. Why is it the camera guys can't do it? I just don't understand. Because there is a weakness with smartphones. You can't manually focus the smartphone. Where else with cameras, you can set a manual focusing. Let me show you what I meant by that. Here I'm using a smartphone at 240 frames per second to record how a teaspoon of coffee powder drops. But it is slightly blurred. My fingers are okay. My fingers are almost well focused, but I'm not sure whether it's focusing on the spoon or on the background. The next part of the video, high-speed video, was to show the coffee powder falling into the glass. But you will notice that the camera is focused to the bottom of the glass. It cannot focus on the coffee powder because the coffee powder hasn't dropped yet. Can you see the smartphone loses focus temporarily and it can't find, see, it's lost focus. It can't find what is the subject, right? If I had manual focusing, I can set the focus at a specific distance even though the coffee powder hasn't dropped yet. And when the coffee powder drops, everything will be in focus. I think smartphones are excellent devices for the average user, but they have their limitations. Eventually, people, those who are serious about photography, will realize that there's a limit to what you can do with smartphones, and they can be very irritating. In the middle of using my smartphone to do some videos, a message will crop up, or some this stupid thing has this Bill Bixley or whatever it is, AI guy that will come up and block the screen with a certain message, and I can't press any of the buttons while that stupid message is being shown on the smartphone. And the other thing I noticed is when I'm using the smartphone, I accidentally will hit some of these buttons and something else will do. The nice thing, the best thing about cameras is they have manual buttons. You can turn them and switch them around. It's not a smart screen, and that is why cameras will always dominate eventually for the serious photographers. Yes, smartphones got beautiful images and all that, but there's only so much you can do with them. This smartphone is Samsung S9 Plus, is a 8 megapixel image. My out of date old Sony Alpha 5100 cheap camera, almost the same price as this, is 24 megapixels. So when I want to go and print something, which do you think I'm going to use? The camera, not my smartphone, right? There are huge advantages of using a camera over a smartphone. Smartphone is good if you're walking around town and you want to take a picture of something, you didn't bring your camera or you didn't bring all your lenses and cameras. That's an advantage. But if you are really want to seriously go into photography and do some really beautiful artistic work or videos, stay with the cameras. I don't like this cameras getting smaller and smaller, right? It becomes too difficult to hold, and even the screen, right? You can't really see what's on the screen. This is the problem with this screen also. You can't see whether you're out of focus or in focus. The last video I showed you about the coffee beans, coffee powder dropping into the glass, I couldn't see that the smartphone was slightly out of focus. If I had known that my teaspoon of coffee was slightly out of focus, I would have brought the camera back a bit, because it was within the minimum distance of the smartphone camera. So that's why it was slightly out of focus. One of the reasons. So what do you think? It's the camera guys, manufacturers, Sony, Nikon, Fujifilm, Canon, all can actually introduce 240 frames per second high-speed videos. Why are they not doing it yet? Let me know. Do you think that all cameras can move to high-speed videos? I won't be surprised, some of the more advanced cameras, the later technologies, all they have to do is upgrade the firmware. Isn't it?